So don't miss this, my friends. Some of us here, we may be struggling to overcome our present suffering. You need to be reminded of what John has described Jesus with. That he reminds you and I that Jesus is aware of our struggles being in our midst, and that he is totally in charge of what is going on in your life. Jesus reveals who he is to the persecuted church. Jesus reveals who he is to the persecuted church. Now, there are notable Christians in history who have endured persecution for their believing loyalty in God. From the Bible times, we have Peter and Paul. And in early church history, we have Bonhoeffer and Bunyan. But more recently and closer to home, we know that there are Christians in East Asia, in the Middle East, and in South Asia who have endured persecution and imprisonment for their faith in Jesus, even when it hurts. I know of a pastor in South Asia who lost her husband because her husband was assassinated by religious radicals. And incredibly, many years later, she was the one who led those who were involved in that murder to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. I know of another pastor in the Middle East who stayed faithful to pastor his church despite regular threats of being bombed because they were at war. He told me that he doesn't even know who will turn up in church that weekend because they don't know whether they are alive or have fled the country, or whether his church will still even be there because of the bombing. Why were these Christians able to endure such persecution and suffering? I submit to you, it's because they know about the hope that Jesus assures them with. This hope that goes beyond all their present suffering. And so for all of us here, for some of us here who are going through present suffering, enduring persecution, it becomes critical then for us and for them and for us to remember why we are even enduring persecution and suffering in the first place. You see, in the opening address to all the churches, starting in Ephesus, in Revelation chapter 2, verse 1, Christ was described as him who holds the 7 stars in his right hand, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands. Now, these stars and lampstands were words that John used from his preceding vision in Revelation chapter 1. If you remember that sermon, we talked about these 2 symbols, stars and lampstands, and it actually contains, or this vision contains, Old Testament references. Now, the people who were receiving the words of John, they had a Jewish thinking, they have a Jewish mindset, and they are familiar with the prophetic writings of Zechariah and Daniel. And so they will understand that these stars that Jesus holds in his right hand, they were talking about angels overseeing each of the churches. And the lampstands were referring to the collective group of believers that Jesus addressed. And these believers had the mission of being witnesses for Jesus as lampstands. So as the person holding the 7 stars in his right hand, Jesus here was being portrayed as someone who is totally in charge. And as someone who was walking among the 7 golden lampstands, Jesus was being portrayed here as always in their midst, always in charge, and always in their midst. So don't miss this, my friends. Some of us here, we may be struggling to overcome our present suffering. You need to be reminded of what John has described Jesus with. That he reminds you and I that Jesus is aware of our struggles being in our midst, and that he is totally in charge of what is going on in your life. To the second church in Smyrna, chapter 2, verse 8, Jesus was described as the first and the last, the one who died and came to life. And later on in the sermon, we will unpack what the church in Smyrna will go through. But here, John sets the stage for this church through his description of Christ. As the first and the last, Jesus alone possesses the attribute of eternity. And as the one who died and came to life, Jesus has overcome even death itself. So what an assurance for the church who's hearing this, going through persecution, wondering whether they'll be alive or not. They hear that Jesus is victorious over death. And not just over death temporarily, but over death permanently, forever. Do I have an amen for that? Jesus is victorious over death and is victorious over death forever. Finally, in Jesus' address to the church in Philadelphia in chapter 3, verse 7, he was described as the Holy One, the True One, who has the key of David, who opens and no one will shut, who shuts and no one opens. Now pay attention to how Jesus was being described here. This was actually a reference to the house of David. And John borrowed the words again from an Old Testament book, Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 22, verse 22. You can see that these two verses are really similar. What John wanted to tell the church is that Jesus has the highest authority, house of David, highest authority and control over those who are entering the kingdom. Now, because of this description of who Jesus is, it gave them the assurance that Jesus is now the anchor in their hope in all their present suffering. So for those of us here who are interceding for our loved ones to be saved, for our loved ones to come back to the Christian faith, we must remember that Jesus has the highest authority and He is totally in control over who enters God's kingdom. Now, these revelations of Jesus to the persecuted church assures us that we have a hope that goes beyond all our present suffering. You see, those experiencing persecution and suffering shouldn't just know why they are experiencing it, but they need to know who is on their team. And with these descriptions of who Christ is, John was describing to the churches, Jesus reminding them of who He is. Not just the why or what you need to go through, but remember, I am on your team. Now, you know, if Lionel Messi, the World Cup winner, was on my team when I was playing football, even if I have 10 blisters and a broken leg, I will continue playing because victory is assured. Correct? And so because we have Jesus, victory is assured. Amen? Amen.